Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Star Hazy, otherwise known as Opie. Welcome back to another video. This week I thought I'd do something a little different, not straying too far away from my normal speed paints, but I wanted to let you in on my process when it comes to creating a watercolor from start to finish, the processes that I usually go through from the very beginning sketch layer all the way to a finished, polished watercolor piece. So let's just get right into it. I want to start out by showing you these swatches that I did of different watercolor paints and little thumbnails just to get a decent idea of what composition I wanted to use and what colors I wanted to use in the composition. I knew I wanted the fish and the yin and yang to have a high contrast since it is a yin and yang symbol. You got to have both extremes on both sides, but I didn't want to do a typical black and white. So I was testing out different contrasting colors and I came across the good contrast of a purpley pink mixed with a green yellow sort of color. And they're not completely opposite on the color wheel, but I thought they would work super nicely. And if I hadn't done those little swatches at the beginning, little color testing thumbnails, if you will, I would have never realized that I would like the idea of making the fish's body a different color than its fins. I really like how I mixed the purple body with the green fins and vice versa for the other fish. Think it makes a really nice contrast between the two fish, which is what I wanted to do with the yin-yang in the middle. The whole piece is about balance and contrast and the balance that you can find in the midst of all of the contrast. So anyway, after I've done the swatches of the thumbnails and decided what colors I want where, I just go ahead and start laying flat washes throughout the whole painting. And I think it's a really good idea to make sure that you flat wash every single part of the painting. Don't leave any white spots unless you want like subtle spots of white for your highlights. Go ahead and lay the flat washes for each and every individual spot. So I did the flat washes for the body and the fins of each of the fish and the yin and yang and the circles that connect them both, as well as the background, so you will see that start to develop here soon. And the thing you really want to remember about laying down your flat washes is that you want it to be a very light color, like the very lightest base color of the object that you're painting. So you can see that I made it really, really light green, really, really light pink purpley on all of it, and then with this background color as well, super, super light gray. I knew that was going to be the base of the background, even though the background was going to be very dynamic and have a lot of contrast. So just make sure that you're you're watering down the watercolors super, super well and making sure that it's even throughout the whole thing. So you can see here as I'm doing the background that I am taking my time and making sure that it's all one solid base color. And then here I am finally going in and starting to add a little bit of contrast in the corners. Alright, so once you've finished flatting all of the different things in your piece, you're going to want to go ahead and start adding a little bit of contrast. Basically the second layer of your painting, where you're adding more contrast to your base layers. You can go ahead and just make your colors not as watered down and use the same color that you're using as your base color, just like I said, not as watered down. So that way you're starting to add contrast, but you can still see that lightness that's left underneath. That's the beauty of watercolor, is that it's super transparent and you can just slowly build up the contrast, yet there's still that transparency, which I think is super, super beautiful. So you can just see me going ahead and adding contrast in the different parts where I thought there'd be shadow, and I'm doing a little bit of line work, as you can see, with the watercolors, just where the fin would be, and just contrast in the body just to give the body shape. And then I added some contrast to these different circles and the yin and yang to give it a roundness that it wouldn't have otherwise. So you can see that there's light hitting the object and giving it that 3D form, whereas if you'd left it just flat, it would have been super flat and 2D. Why'd I just say flat and then flat? If you make it flat, it's going to be more flat. Anyway, adding more contrast, more and more contrast. So here I'm basically on the third layer of adding contrast. So each layer you add is only going to be slightly darker than the one before. And also another thing I should note about adding the second layer is I made sure that my colors weren't super saturated. In order to make them darker, I also added a little bit of Payne's gray just to make them. And when I say a little bit of Payne's gray, I mean a little bit of Payne's gray, just to give it a little bit of desaturation, which gives more contrast and makes the colors underneath really pop, because the colors underneath are definitely saturated and then the ones on top are darker. And if you think about it, shadows are less saturated because there's less light hitting them. So the colors of the object that the light is hitting is going to be a little desaturated because there's not as much light illuminating it. Am I making any sense? Hope that made sense. Anyway, add a little bit of gray to your darker colors and it will look very nice. Alright, here you can see I'm going in the background and adding more contrast to the corners. I really wanted to give this painting a vignette sort of feeling so that basically the whole border was darker than the inside, therefore bringing your focus to the very center. And these are all things you want to think about while you're creating a piece too, is where people's focus are, where are the deepest contrasts, and then where is there less contrast. Just, you know, think about those things. If you want me to do a whole video about that and about composition and focus, let me know. I've been learning a lot about that recently, and it's really good stuff when you're making full pieces like this where there's different parts of it, but it all connects into one unified piece. I also wanted to mention that when I was first painting this, I really hated the way the background was turning out. So I'm already moving on to the colored pencil phase, but I go in later with more watercolor just to give the background more contrast. I'd felt like there wasn't enough in the background to really bring out the fish and the yin and yang symbol, so I go back in later. But the next step for your watercolor pieces is to go in with colored pencils, and oh yep, here we go. This is where I go back in with watercolor, make it a lot darker. And that's the thing about creating any kind of artwork, is the process is always super fluid. If you feel like you need to go back in and add darker watercolor to your piece, you go ahead and do that. You do whatever you need to do to make your piece feel right to you. So it's not like step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this. There is a light, fluid process that you could follow if you want, but if you need to go back and add a little more watercolor, then go ahead and do that. And in part of this video you can see me taking a blow dryer to my watercolor piece. That's always super nice too if you want it to be dry in order to move on to your next layer, because you don't want to go in with watercolor for your second layer when the layer beneath it is still wet. The beauty about waiting for your layers to dry in between is that you can really add the next layer of contrast on top of already dry, lighter layer. And it takes a lot of patience, watercolor, and I think that's why I used to hate watercolor when I was a kid. I never would paint with watercolor back in high school. I hated it. It took way too much patience. I was like, you can't even add contrast. You can't do this and that. It's a mess. It's always a mess. But back then I had no patience. I wouldn't wait for the first layer to dry. And I just couldn't appreciate the beauty of watercolor because I was lacking that patience that the medium really deserves and needs. So just remember that when you're working with watercolor, just have patience and the watercolor will work with you if you give it that patience and a little bit of its own freedom. Watercolor has a mind of its own sometimes, so just give it that a little bit of its own freedom and it will give you a lot in return as far as the beauty of your pieces go. Alright, so one of the final layers is going in with pen or ink, whatever you feel comfortable with, and just making a nice little outline. And this is totally unnecessary. This is just something that I like to do. I really like the dark outline of ink and watercolors together, but you certainly don't have to go in and ink afterwards. But like I said, I really like the definition that adding ink adds. What is up with me today and repeating words over and over in a sentence? All right. Adding ink adds super contrast, if you know what I mean. Anyway. Voiceovers, man. Alright, so anyway, I'm adding a lot of line work here just to show the contours of the different fish. I really like to do a bunch of contours just following the flow of the fish's fins. Say that 10 times in a row, fish's fins. So anyway, I just do line working away here, making the fins look super nice. Making sure that the different line qualities are there. It's really nice to add different thicknesses in your line weight to add more contrast. I think what's really nice about a finished piece is the different details that add the definition and contrast, and you can really do that with every different part of the process, and that's the beauty of each different step. The thing about the inking process too is that it just takes a good amount of time to go through and make sure everything is inked properly and done well. And I think it's really important to take your time here, even though for me at least, it gets really repetitive, and I found myself getting bored during this part. I don't know why. Like I said, I just think it's because it's super repetitive, but it's really worth it. Like I said, if you give it the patience that it deserves, and because I had inked the whole first fish, and I was like, oh, nice, that looks freaking awesome. And then I go in to start inking the second fish, I'm like, oh, Oh my gosh. I have to go in and do a whole nother one. I hope I don't mess this up. And I feel like that happens a lot with artists. It's like you get one part of your piece looking super good and you're like, oh no. You have that dread, like, oh, I have to do the whole second fish, and what if it doesn't turn out as good as the first fish? And then I've actually gone without finishing pieces because of that fear and that worry, like, oh, I'm not going to do this other half of the painting as good as the first half, so I'm not even going to finish it. So anyway, have the patience, believe in yourself, and yeah, push through that slight boredom and it'll look awesome. And I went ahead and started adding more details to the fin and just making sure that I'm adding a little bit of shading with the ink as well. I like to really add that deep dark contrast that gives it a lot of definition and a little bit of, I wouldn't say realism, but semi-realism. Anyway, I want to mention the final step before I go. I will go in with a white gel pen. You can also do this with white acrylic paint or white ink, like white ink out of a bottle if you want. And you just go ahead and add a bunch of white highlights and details if you want. It's super stylized depending on how much white ink you add. I added a bunch to this piece, but you don't even have to add white ink if you don't want to. I just really like the way it gives it sort of a magical feeling, which is super beautiful and super fun, especially in comparison to my dark background that I've got going on. So I just go ahead and add some bubbles in the background and highlights to each of the fins and their bodies. And yeah, you can always add these highlights to like a character's eyes, or if you want something to look a little wet, you can add the white highlights. So anyway, I think this is where I will wrap it up. Oh wait, I totally forgot to mention, you can go back in with colored pencils in the end. Like I said, the creative process, super fluid. If you feel like it needs to be darker, you make it darker. Here, I definitely wanted it to be a little more purpley in the fins, so I came back in with my dark purple colored pencil. And these are the Prismacolor colored pencils. Oh no, these are Faber-Castell. Oh my goodness. Wow. Anyway, no, these are Faber-Castell pencils. Anyway, they're really nice pencils. I have a bunch of them. And yeah, so it adds a little bit more glow, if you will, too, if you add colored pencil afterwards. Like you can see me adding dark green and dark purple, and it just really gives it this nice dark glow of sorts, like where it's that hint of color. And I think that really adds a lot of life to it when you have more variety in your colors. And I think that colored pencil can really add a different type of texture, especially when you're working with cold pressed paper like I am here. The colored pencil adds a lot of texture, which is interesting and nice, but you can't really tell in the video because it's not zoomed in enough, but there's definitely a texture where that colored pencil is that gives it an interesting, magical, artsy feeling, if you will. Anyway, I think I'm gonna end it here. Hopefully this process made sense to you and helped you in a way, because I remember when I was first starting painting with watercolor, I just didn't know where to start. Like I said, I didn't have patience. I wouldn't paint in layers. I would try to paint it all at once. And the thing about watercolors is you really do need to do it in layers, so that way, I don't want to be preachy. Paint how you will if you want. But it's really nice if you can paint it in layers and really let it build up on itself. And it can be really magical and awesome. And I hope I didn't say magical too much. Alright, anyway, I will see you guys next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.